Hi everyone, I'm a European expat living and working here in Singapore. I have recently returned from my 5th trip to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And in today's video, I'm gonna compare Singapore with Kuala Lumpur. Which one is better for living as an expat? And I know that some of you would immediately say, well, GDP per capita of Singapore is 7 times higher than in Malaysia, so the winner is clear, no need to watch this video. Hold your horses. Some things are good in Singapore, but some things are also good in Kuala Lumpur. Kuala Lumpur has a couple of aces under the sleeves that will make you think twice. In today's video, I'm gonna look into 7 categories: climate, salaries, taxes and cost of living, housing, public transport and car ownership, entertainment, expat-friendly, is it a good location to travel? My goal today is to lay out all the facts, namely advantages and downsides of each city in each category, and let you decide which one is better for living as an expat. And again, I will be looking at both cities through the lens of an expat, not a local. The locals have a completely different experience in both cities. Without further ado, let's go! Let me start from saying that both Singapore and Kuala Lumpur have a lot in common. Both are tropical cities with a modern skyline populated by 3 ethnic groups, namely Malay, Chinese, and Indians, with a large expat community. English language is very popular in both Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. In Singapore, it's one of the official languages, and in Kuala Lumpur, it's also very widespread. Both Singapore and Kuala Lumpur even look alike. Can you guess if this is Singapore or KL? Yes, you guessed this right, it's KL because electronic scooters are prohibited in Singapore. But if I didn't show you an e-scooter, you would probably think twice before answering the question, because those cities, they really look very similar. Alright, so what are the differences? Category number 1, climate. As I just mentioned, both Singapore and KL are tropical cities. This means that they have more or less the same temperature all year long, and they only have 2 seasons, a dry season and a rainy season. Each of them spans around 6 months. Both have sunrises and sunsets every day around the same time. Both Singapore and KL have 12 hours of daytime and 12 hours of nighttime every single day throughout the year. Unlike in Europe, where you have longer daytime during the summer period and longer nighttime during the winter period. However, there are minor differences. Singapore sits right at the equator. KL is a little bit more to the northwest. It takes around 30 minutes, half an hour to fly from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur, or just 5 hours by bus. They have recently launched a train, I haven't tried that one yet. Since Singapore is closer to the equator, the climate in Singapore is more stable than in KL. For example, the difference between day and night in Singapore is just 3 degrees Celsius. If it's 30 degrees during the day, it's gonna be around 27 degrees during the night in Singapore. Since Kuala Lumpur is a little bit more to the north, the difference in temperature between day and night will be a little bit wider. So for example, if it's 30 degrees during the day in KL, it's gonna be around 24-25 degrees during the night. Same goes with the humidity level. Both KL and Singapore have high humidity level, but in Singapore it can go up to 80%, 80, while in KL it's around 70%. Still very humid, but less humid than in Singapore. Both Singapore and KL sit in a geographically stable zone. Neither city experiences natural disasters such as typhoons, earthquakes, volcano eruptions like their neighbors in Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. Both Singapore and KL have heavy tropical rains during the rainy season. In other words, the only difference in climate between Singapore and Kuala Lumpur is that KL is a little bit cooler at night than Singapore and a little bit less humid than Singapore. I personally love Singaporean climate, but I do think that it's a little bit hotter than I would like to and a little bit more humid than I would like to. So if I have to choose between KL and Singapore climate, I would probably go more with the KL climate. But again, Singapore climate is very similar. There's not much difference between them. Category number 2, salaries, taxes, and cost of living. It is a well-known fact that Singapore has higher salaries and lower income tax than Malaysia. So you would say, well, that's all I need to know. Let's move to the next category. Not yet. We also need to take into consideration cost of living. How much it costs to live in each of those two cities. And not surprisingly, the prices in Kuala Lumpur are way lower than in Singapore. An average salary in Singapore is 6,000 to 7,000 Singaporean dollars a month. In Kuala Lumpur, it's 6.7 thousand Malaysian ringgit. And I'm talking specifically about an average salary in Kuala Lumpur, not in Malaysia. Of course, in KL, it's higher than in the rest of the country because KL is the capital. So you get 6.7 thousand in local Singaporean dollars versus 6.7 thousand Malaysian ringgit. 1 Singapore dollar is 3 Malaysian ringgit. So essentially the Singaporean salary is 3 times higher than the salary in Kuala Lumpur. However, prices in KL are 2 to 3 times lower than in Singapore. So yes, your salary in Singapore is 3 times higher, but then your prices are 2 or 3 times higher than in Kuala Lumpur. At the same time, taxes are lower in Singapore. The highest income tax bracket in Singapore is 24%. So you will never pay more income tax in Singapore than 24%. In Malaysia, it's 30%. So you will pay slightly more in KL and you will take home slightly less in Kuala Lumpur than in Singapore. A rent price for a 1-bedroom apartment in a nice area in Singapore would be around 3,000 Singapore dollars. In a nice area in KL, it will be around 3,000 Malaysian ringgit. However, the size of your apartment in Kuala Lumpur will be at least 2 times larger than the one in Singapore. In other words, you earn more in Singapore, but you also spend more in Singapore than in Kuala Lumpur. In my view, Kuala Lumpur offers you a slightly higher quality of life. The cost of living in Kuala Lumpur is lower relative to the salary you're getting. You're getting a larger apartment, but Singapore is better for wealth accumulation. Next category is public transport and car ownership. Singapore has one of the best public transportation systems in the world. It has buses and metro. It's called MRT here in Singapore, Mass Rapid Transit. Both buses and MRT cover the entire city. They're fast and efficient and they go very frequently. They're also quite affordable. What is not affordable in Singapore is cars. Cars in Singapore are the most expensive in the world, and I'm not joking. The government of Singapore has deliberately introduced high taxes, tariffs, prices in general for car ownership. And then you can only use your car for 10 years, after which you have to go through the same costly process again. However, as a result, people rely more on public transport, the air is not polluted, and you don't have major traffic on the roads. It's quite the opposite in Kuala Lumpur. They do have metro lines, but they don't cover the entire city, and I didn't really see that many buses on the streets of Kuala Lumpur. But on the other hand, cars are not as expensive as in Singapore, so the majority of population relies on cars and motorbikes. But as a result, you have heavy traffic on the roads. It's also worth noting that taxis are quite affordable in both KL and Singapore. It really depends on your preferences. Do you want to have a car? Are you okay to use public transport? Do you want to use a taxi? I personally rely on public transport here in Singapore and I'm happy. Category number 4, housing. As an expat in Singapore, you have a limited number of housing units which you can rent or buy. Singapore has roughly just 2 types of housing units, so-called HDBs and condos. HDB stands for Housing and Development Board. Those are housing units meant for Singaporeans or permanent residents, and they are highly subsidized by the government of Singapore, and it's 80% of all housing units here in Singapore. There is 20% units, they're called condos or condominiums, and they are meant for both Singaporeans and expats without a permanent residence, like myself. Condos are usually 2 times more expensive for rent or for purchase than a similar type apartment in an HDB. And if an expat decides to buy an apartment in a condo here in Singapore, you will have to pay an extra 60% property tax. My apartment, for example, the one I'm staying right now, I'm renting obviously, it costs 1.1 million Singaporean dollars. I checked on Property Guru. That's roughly 800,000 US dollars. If I want to buy this apartment, I will have to pay an extra 60% property tax, which is around 660,000 Singaporean dollars. So the overall price for this apartment, for me as an expat without a permanent residence, will be 1.8 million Singaporean dollars, whereas if a Singaporean decides to buy the same apartment, they will pay 1.1 million Singapore dollars, and if they buy a similar apartment in an HDB housing unit, it will be half of that price. And it's not that easy to get a permanent residence here in Singapore. Some countries offer an investment into property programs that allow you to stay in that country and get a permanent residence or a long-term visa. To my knowledge, Singapore doesn't have such program for property, but you can be a CEO or you can be a business leader and you can open your own business here in Singapore, and you have to invest at least 10 million Singaporean dollars, which is roughly 7.5 million US dollars, and then you can get a permanent residence here in Singapore. Kuala Lumpur has no limitation in terms of renting apartments for expats. You can rent any unit in any house you want. When it comes to buying a property in Kuala Lumpur, the only limitation is that your apartment's price has to be no less than 1 million ringgit, which is roughly 220,000 US dollars. And the tax that you're gonna pay for buying a property is 4 or 5%, so incomparable to 60% you're paying here in Singapore. Apartments in Kuala Lumpur are as nice as in Singapore. They also have swimming pools and gyms, but they are usually larger than the ones in Singapore. Next category, entertainment. You can hear quite often from Singaporeans that Singapore is one of the most boring cities in the world. I strongly disagree with that. I even created a video in which I discuss main things Singaporeans complain about and whether I agree with them. Long story short, I strongly disagree that Singapore is boring. I think that Singapore has so many interesting places to go to. Singapore has a lot of concerts, restaurants, rooftop bars, clubs, libraries, parks, you name it. There's always something you can do in Singapore. If you feel bored in Singapore, Singapore is not boring. You are. I can always find things to do in Singapore. And I don't think that KL is boring either. It has the second tallest building in the world, the Merdeka 118. It has, of course, Petronas Towers. It has a beautiful KLCC park, Batu Caves, and many, many more places to go. However, there is one major difference between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. Singapore is a city-state. Kuala Lumpur is a capital of a larger country. So if you feel bored in Singapore, you have to travel overseas. If you feel bored in Kuala Lumpur, you can always go outside of the city and you will still stay in the same country. You can stay on the mainland Malaysia, or you can travel to Borneo Island, which is a relatively large island that Malaysia shares with Indonesia and Brunei. In other words, while both Singapore and KL have a lot of things to do and a lot of places to go, you can always escape Kuala Lumpur by just taking a bus and traveling around Malaysia, or flying to Borneo Island, while in Singapore you can also take a bus or a train to Malaysia, or a boat to Indonesia, or a flight to any other part of the world, but you have to leave Singapore as a country, whereas in Malaysia you can stay in the same country and not in the same city. Speaking of traveling, next category, Singapore and Kuala Lumpur are very strategically located. If you are an expat who wants to relocate to Singapore or to Kuala Lumpur to explore Southeast Asia and Asia in general, either of these cities is a good starting point. Such top tourist destinations like Bangkok, the most visited city in 2025, or Bali, one of the most favorite islands in the world. They're so close to both Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. Both cities have very good airports. Singapore has the best airport in the world. KL also has a very decent airport. Singapore has the second best airline in the world, Singapore Airlines. KL also has a lot of nice airlines, so you can travel anywhere in Southeast Asia, and there's not much difference between the cities. KL and Singapore are very close to each other. As I mentioned before, the flight time between Singapore and Kuala Lumpur is just 30 minutes. So essentially anywhere you travel from those two cities, you will get around the same time, whether you fly from Singapore, whether you fly from KL. Of course, if you fly from KL to the north, so to the opposite direction from Singapore, it will take you 30 minutes quicker to get to Thailand. But if you're flying from Singapore to the south, let's say to Bali, it will take you 30 minutes less to travel there than from KL. But essentially, you're gonna spend more or less the same time traveling from KL or from Singapore to any other part of the world. I noticed that sometimes flights from KL are cheaper than from Singapore, so I personally traveled 2 times from Singapore to KL by bus, stayed there for a couple of days, enjoyed the vibrant city, and then took a cheaper flight from KL to other destinations, and it was cheaper than to travel to the same destinations from Singapore. But on average, the prices are more or less the same. And finally, let's talk about how expat-friendly Singapore and Kuala Lumpur are. Of course, there's no way to measure expat friendliness, so I decided to talk about several factors. English language is widely spoken in both Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, but it's an official language here in Singapore, and it's popular and informal way of communication in KL, but it's not official in Malaysia. Nevertheless, I never had an issue communicating in English in Kuala Lumpur or in Singapore. How large is the expat community in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur? In Singapore, 1 in 3 residents are foreigners. In KL, it's 1 in 10. So you're more likely to meet a non-local in Singapore than in Malaysia. On the other hand, Singapore introduced more restrictive measures for foreigners coming into the country. The government of Singapore increased the threshold for the salary required to issue an employment pass. In general, Singapore is no longer issuing the same number of employment passes, work visas, as in the past, while Malaysia welcomes expats with open arms. It's also important to note that it's difficult not just to get to Singapore, but also to stay in Singapore longer. Here in Singapore, I'm tied to my employer. If I want to change my job, I need to change my visa, and not every employer in Singapore wants to do that. However, in Malaysia, you have longer-term visas even if you're not employed in Malaysia. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, you can invest money in the property in Kuala Lumpur and get a residency visa, which is not the case in Singapore. On the other hand, Singaporean dollar is a more stable currency than Malaysian ringgit. If your goal as an expat is to come to Southeast Asia for a couple of years, travel around Asia, and then go back, and you don't really want to accumulate wealth, then in this case, KL works for you. If you want to accumulate wealth and have a stable currency, then Singapore will be a better option for you. In terms of public safety, both KL and Singapore are quite safe, but Singapore is one of the safest cities in the world. KL still ranks high, but it's not at the same level as Singapore. If you are a tall European guy with blue eyes like myself, you will have no issues in Kuala Lumpur or in Singapore, no one will be staring at you and pointing fingers as in some other Asian countries. So don't worry about that. Kuala Lumpurians and Singaporeans are quite used to tall Europeans with blue eyes. To conclude, I love Kuala Lumpur. It has a slightly cooler climate at night than Singapore, lower humidity level, which I personally really appreciate. You can own a car in Kuala Lumpur and the cost of living is lower. Some expats call Kuala Lumpur a city where luxury is affordable. And it's not a problem to rent an electric scooter in Kuala Lumpur, which again I personally appreciate. But in Singapore, you have higher salaries, lower taxes, less traffic on the streets, and a larger expat community. So it's up to you to decide which city is better for you. I hope this video was useful and I see you in my next video.